I'm going to share with you 8 points demonstrating why Edgar Allan Poe is extremely unlikely to have been the real author of The Raven. And then afterwards, I'm going to read the poem from the original source that Matthew Franklin Whittier submitted it to, the February 1845 American Review. And of course, I am Matthew Franklin Whittier's reincarnation, or so I claim. So now let's get to the 8 points. Firstly, Poe had never written a poem like this before, certainly not before he was given a copy of the poem by Matthew Franklin Whittier in January of 1842, as I believe. But Matthew had written several and published several poems in basically the same style and of comparable quality before The Raven was published. Secondly, Poe never used pseudonyms. Now, people will tell you that he did, but in 1827, there are a couple examples of him using aliases. He signed up with the Army as Edgar A. Perry, and he published his book, Tamerlane and Other Poems, signing A. Bostonian, and there was, I think, one other instance. But those were because he was trying to escape his creditors. He'd run up gambling debts, and he was trying to avoid his creditors catching up with him. He never used pseudonyms for literary modesty, see, and he never used them again. So that's not correct that Poe used pseudonyms. So the original publication of The Raven was under the pseudonym Blank Quarles, and that was Matthew Franklin Whittier's pseudonym, and it had a deep personal meaning for him. Poe didn't publish that version of it at all. Edgar Allan Poe's wife, Virginia, was still alive when The Raven was published, so he was not in grief. And people apologizing for Poe will say that he was in anticipatory grief. You know, well, I have a master's in counseling. I focused on death and dying, and there is no such bird as anticipatory grief. People don't go into grief until the loved one dies, and even then they're in shock and can't believe it and don't really start grieving for some time afterwards. So there is no such thing as grieving ahead of time, and The Raven is definitely a grief poem. And nor was it a poem written in imagination by someone who still felt grief for his mother from many years ago from his childhood. It's just not. And again, I've got a master's in counseling. The people that give opinions like that do not have training, academic training in psychology, see, or they wouldn't say such things. Fourthly, it would have been very cruel of Poe to publish that poem while his wife Virginia was still fighting for her life against tuberculosis. Some people did recover from tuberculosis. It wasn't necessarily a death sentence, but it would have been like emotionally burying her prematurely to publish that poem. It would have been devastating to her. And it was just cruel. So it was cruel even to plagiarize it and claim authorship, no less to have actually written it. Fifthly, George Graham, the owner of Graham's Magazine, who was Poe's former employer, turned down The Raven. He rejected that poem when Poe was destitute and brought it to him. And there's only one logical reason why George Graham would reject that poem, because he was an astute publisher. He knew good quality work that was worth publishing when he saw it. And this is a world-class poem. So he knew how good it was. He couldn't possibly have rejected it based on quality. That means knowing Poe, knowing his personal character, he suspected it was plagiarized. And he was afraid of publishing it because he didn't want his magazine to get sued. It's the only logical explanation. Now, there's some accounts of Poe reciting The Raven aloud to groups, and he was awful. He didn't understand the poem, and he wasn't able to read it aloud. Okay, that's very suspicious. So there's a couple examples I'll read to you. In the January 8th, 1903 edition of the Indiana Upland Monitor is an article entitled Poe's Last Recitation in City of Richmond. It quotes Dr. John F. Carter from another magazine, and Dr. Carter says, "It was at Mrs. Mackenzie's that I first heard Poe recite, at her request, The Raven and Annabel Lee." Annabel Lee was also Matthew Franklin Whittier's poem originally. only the family being present. From an unusually lively mood, he lapsed at once into a manner, expression, and tone of voice of gloomy and almost weird solemnity, gazing as if on something invisible to others, and never changing his position until the recitation was concluded. Then later in a performance, I'm skipping forward in the article, we arrived some moments after the appointed time, and to our surprise, found instead of a full audience, but 9 persons assembled, we together with the usher making 13 in number. Some time elapsed before Poe made his appearance, when he took his place on the platform, bowed, and, resting his hands on the back of a chair, recited The Raven and Annabel Lee, but in a mechanical sort of way, and with a total lack of the weird and gloomy expression which had given them such effect at Mrs. Mackenzie's. On concluding, he again bowed and abruptly left the platform. Then we have another example from the Richmond Examiner, as quoted in the article, Israfel, The Life and Times of Edgar Allan Poe by Herbie Allen. And this concerns Poe's lecture on the poetic principle. And he says, his various pieces of criticism upon the popular poets of the country were for the most part just and were very entertaining. But we were disappointed in Mr. Poe's recitations. We had heard a good deal of his manner, but it does not answer our wants. His voice is soft and distinct, but neither clear nor sonorous. He does not make rhyme effective. He reads all verse like blank verse, and yet he gives it a sing-song of his own more monotonous than any versification. On the last 2 syllables of every sentence, he invariably falls a fifth, which means he drops his voice down at the end. He did not make his own Raven an effective piece of reading. Now, here's a third example. This is Matthew Franklin Whittier himself, myself in the 19th century, who attended one of these readings. He's signing his B in the November 17, 1849 edition of the Boston Weekly Museum. And he remarks rather mischievously about Poe's reading of The Raven. For many reasons, I consider that I was fortunate in hearing him recite his poem, Al-Araf, before the Boston Lyceum 4 years ago. Many reasons means he wanted to sit up front and see if he could rattle Poe, okay? Probably he was quite as unpopular in Boston as in any other city, and the circumstances attending his performance injured him variously in the opinions of the Bostonians more than anything he had previously done. 2/3 of his audience left before he closed, but with the most imperturbable sang-froid. In other words, he was not showing any sign of being upset at Matthew sitting there staring at him in the front row. He requested the presiding officer to announce to those still in the house that if they would remain, he would be pleased to recite to them The Raven. All was hushed at once, and Mr. Poe recited that remarkable poem in a manner that will never be repeated. Now, you know how to interpret that little piece of code. It's a manner that will never be repeated because Poe has died like 4 years ago. Okay. He says the poem is remarkable, but basically that Poe's recitation of it was awful. Now, the 7th point here has to do with the philosophy of composition, which really doesn't require any commentary. You just have to read it. It's absurd. It's so awful and so childish. All he did was to reverse engineer the poem and pretend that he had written it. So, you know, scholars looking at this, they're divided right down the middle. Officially, they all take it literally, which is utterly ridiculous. You know, some of them privately will say, oh, it's got to have been a hoax. He couldn't possibly have written it this way, see? But none of them will put their name in print and say, that's my belief, see? They all refer to other colleagues that feel that way. So here we have Dennis Paul in a chapter entitled Decomposing Poe's Philosophy. In the opening, he says, given the way Poe's fictional works have so persistently attracted the serious attention of language-related theorists, from Charles Baudelaire, I think that's how you pronounce it, in the 19th century to Jacques Lacan and Jacques Derrida in the 20th. It is somewhat surprising that few have ever bothered to examine closely Poe's own theory, especially as set forth in his most forcefully argued essay, The Philosophy of Composition. Why should this be, he asks. No doubt one reason could be that the philosophy has traditionally been discredited as but another of the many hoaxes Poe is supposed to have perpetrated against an unsuspecting readership, its overall purpose being less to reveal the true method of the composition of the Raven than to further enhance the reputation of the already famous poem. That's almost right. What really happened is it's a scam to bolster the previous scam of having claimed writing the Raven in the first place, see? So the philosophy of composition is intended to reinforce his original scam. Now, the eighth point is that despite trying and failing, Poe was never able to write a poem in this style of similar quality after the publication of the Raven. He tried with the poem Eulalame, which is extremely amateurish, in my opinion, compared to the Raven, and he even imitates lines from the Raven in the opening lines of Eulalame. He says, "It was night in the lonesome October of my most immemorial year." Well, that's just parroting, a line from the Raven. So these points are serious and they deserve to be debated in academia. I deserve a seat at the table to debate these things. And instead, they're giving me the cold shoulder and pretending that I don't exist, But these are real solid points here. Now, I'm going to go ahead and take this copy of American Review and open to the Raven and read the poem. Now, be aware of what this is. This is the reincarnated real author of the Raven. Matthew Franklin Whittier, reincarnated as Stephen Sakellarios, reading his own poem. I don't remember writing it, but I remember it emotionally, okay? And I recognize it as being absolutely consistent both with his work and his personal life. There's a lot of very personal references in here. Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered, weak and weary, over many a quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore, while I nodded, nearly napping, suddenly there came a tapping, as of someone gently rapping at my chamber door. "'Tis some visitor," I muttered, tapping at my chamber door. "Only this, and nothing more." Ah, distinctly I remember it was in the bleak December, and each separate dying ember wrought its ghost upon the floor. Eagerly I wished the morrow. Vainly I had tried to borrow from my books surcease of sorrow, sorrow for the lost Lenore, for the rare and radiant maiden whom the angels name Lenore, nameless here forevermore. And the silken, sad, uncertain rustling of each purple curtain thrilled me, filled me with fantastic terrors never felt before, so that now, to still the beating of my heart, I stood repeating, "'Tis some visitor entreating entrance at my chamber door, some late visitor entreating entrance at my chamber door. This it is, and nothing more." Presently my soul grew stronger, hesitating then no longer. "Sir," said I, "or madam, truly your forgiveness I implore, but the fact is I was napping, and so gently you came rapping, and so faintly you came tapping at my chamber door, that I scarce was sure I heard you. Here I opened wide the door. Darkness there, and nothing more." Deep into that darkness peering, long I stood there wondering, fearing, doubting, dreaming dreams no mortal ever dared to dream before. But the silence was unbroken, and the darkness gave no token, and the only word there spoken was the whispered word, "Lenore." This I whispered, and an echo murmured back the word, "Lenore." Merely this, and nothing more. Then into the chamber turning, all my soul within me burning, soon I heard again a tapping somewhat louder than before. "Surely," said I, "surely that is something at my window lattice. Let me see then what thereat is, and this mystery explore. Let my heart be still a moment, and this mystery explore. 'Tis the wind, and nothing more." Open here I flung the shutter, when, with many a flirt and flutter, in there stepped a stately raven of the saintly days of yore. Not the least obeisance made he, not an instant stopped or stayed he, but with mien of lord or lady, perched above my chamber door, perched upon a bust of Pallas just above my chamber door, perched and sat, and nothing more. Then this ebony bird beguiling my sad fancy into smiling, by the grave and stern decorum of the countenance it wore. Though thy crest be shorn and shaven, thou, I said, art sure no craven, ghastly, grim, and ancient raven wandering from the nightly shore. Tell me what thy lordly name is on the night's Plutonian shore. Quoth the raven, nevermore. Much I marveled this ungainly fowl to hear discourse so plainly, though its answer little meaning, little relevancy bore. For we cannot help agreeing that no sublunary being ever yet was blessed with seeing bird above his chamber door, bird or beast upon the sculptured bust above his chamber door, with such name as nevermore. But the raven, sitting lonely on the placid bust, spoke only that one word, as if his soul in that one word he did outpour. Nothing farther then he uttered, not a feather then he fluttered, till I scarcely more than muttered, other friends have flown before, on the morrow he will leave me, as my hopes have flown before. Quoth the raven, nevermore. Wondering at the stillness broken by reply so aptly spoken, doubtless, said I, what it utters is its only stock and store, caught from some unhappy master, whom unmerciful disaster followed fast and followed faster. So, when hope he would adjure, stern despair returned, instead of the sweet hope he dared adjure. That sad answer, nevermore. But the raven still beguiling all my sad soul into smiling, straight I wheeled a cushioned seat in front of bird and bust and door. Then upon the velvet sinking, I betook myself to linking fancy into fancy, thinking what this ominous bird of yore, what this grim, ungainly, ghastly, gaunt, and ominous bird of yore meant in croaking, nevermore. This I sat engaged in guessing, but no syllable expressing to the fowl whose fiery eyes now burned into my bosom's core. This and more I sat divining, with my head at ease reclining on the cushion's velvet lining that the lamplight gloated o'er, but whose velvet violet lining with the lamplight gloating o'er she shall press, nevermore. Then, methought, the air grew denser, perfumed from an unseen censer swung by angels whose faint footfalls tinkled on the tufted floor. Wretch, I cried, thy God hath lent thee, by these angels he hath sent thee respite, respite and nepenthe from thy memories of Lenore. Let me quaff this kind nepenthe, and forget this lost Lenore. Quoth the raven, nevermore. Prophet, said I, thing of evil, prophet still, if bird or devil, whether tempter sent, or whether tempest tossed thee here ashore, desolate, yet all undaunted, on this desert land enchanted, on this home by horror haunted, tell me truly, I implore, is there balm in Gilead? Tell me, I implore. Quoth the raven, nevermore. Prophet, said I, thing of evil, prophet still, if bird or devil, by that heaven that bends above us, by that God we both adore, tell this soul with sorrow laden, if, within the distant Aidenn, it shall clasp a sainted maiden, whom the angels name Lenore, clasp a rare and radiant maiden, whom the angels name Lenore. Quoth the raven, nevermore. Be that word our sign of parting, bird or fiend, I shrieked upstarting, get thee back into the tempest and the night's Plutonian shore. Leave no black plume as a token of that lie thy soul hath spoken. Leave my loneliness unbroken, quit the bust above my door, take thy beak from out my heart, and take thy form from off my door. Quoth the raven, nevermore. And the raven, never flitting, still is sitting on the pallid bust of Pallas just above my chamber door. And his eyes have all the seeming of a demon that is dreaming, and the lamplight o'er him streaming throws his shadow on the floor. And my soul from out that shadow that lies floating on the floor shall be lifted nevermore.